Well, good morning. My apologies. I have to flip between the script and the app that records the audio on. So I didn't want to do any of that wrestling like I did last time. But so today I want to share another podcast that I scripted, but I want to challenge myself. I've told you that I used to be fluently bilingual when I was young, but then not having the ability to use it for 20 years, I was starting to lose it. And over the last, say, 10 years, I've been practicing my translation, right? Because what I found was most important is people who can, hold on, let me double check that it's still recording. Yep, good. So what I found was what we really need is people that can speak both languages, but better can translate. In Canada in particular, translate the French to English so that people can understand. I've talked about some of the instances we've had where I don't think they understand what they're talking about. But after getting really good, so I'm excellent with, I understand French fluently again, and even better, I can actually translate in real time what someone's saying in French into English. But I need to practice my spoken French because it suffered. I mean, I told you, I think I've mentioned this, in decades of being a banker, I used my French, maybe a half dozen times with tourists. Even fellow bankers that live in Quebec would prefer to speak English. Local French speakers would prefer to speak English because, well, same thing. Their confidence with their French. Mine was much more confident at the time, obviously. So they were where I'm at, very embarrassed about their French. So without further ado, I'm going to read the podcast in English first so you know what it says. And if you're so inclined, you can continue to listen as I do it in French. And if you're a French speaker, je vais commencer avec l'émission en anglais, puis en français suit. So just follow along. After the English, there'll be the French of the same podcast, just translated into a Canadian French. Puis après l'anglais, on va commencer l'émission en français, le québécois. So without further ado, the illusion of polyglot mastery. The illusion of polyglot mastery. A philologist's perspective. So the opening scene is a dimly lit study filled with books in multiple languages. The camera pans across open texts in Greek, Latin, Japanese, and Russian. A voice speaks in the background. Language is a living thing. It evolves, it breathes, and it takes root in the mind differently for each speaker. Over the years, I have studied multiple languages, not just learning to speak them, but understanding them deeply. I work with languages as a philologist, applying structural and comparative skills to decipher meaning across cultures and history. And through this, I have discovered something controversial. Most people, even so-called polyglots, cannot truly maintain fluency in more than 2 languages at once. So a shot of a whiteboard with 3 sections, fluent, functional, and recognizable. Each lists different languages underneath. Language acquisition follows a hierarchy. At any given moment, we can maintain one language at a deep, intuitive level, the language in which we think, we dream, and express emotions. A second language fluently but slightly less naturally, perhaps learned later or maintained through daily use. A third or fourth language in a more mechanical way, functional but not truly fluent. Beyond that, comprehension replaces active fluency. We can read, understand, and even translate, but spontaneous production suffers. Now keep in mind this is broadly, this is based on research and study. Sure, there are some people that are exceptional, but they are the rare exception. The vast majority of us struggle to maintain fluency in, well, I guess arguably more than one language even. So cut to clips of famous YouTube polyglots switching between languages. The camera zooms in on awkward pauses, forced grammar, and inconsistencies. What this came about is there's a lot of polyglots online that pretend they speak 50 million languages, but it's very easy to memorize phrases. I've had this happen to me endless times, that because I can pronounce many different languages properly, people automatically assume I'm a native speaker. I've had Russians think that when I worked in the bank. I've had Chinese and Japanese think of that. Just even going into a restaurant or into a museum or a temple. Recently I had a Dutch person, was chuffed German. I actually get wrong a lot, so it's the opposite there. So, online polyglots sell an illusion. They switch languages, impressing their audience, but fluency is not just about recalling words. It's about instinctive grammar, cultural nuances, and emotional resonance. These skills take years to develop, even in a single language. True fluency requires constant maintenance, and adding new languages inevitably reduces the depth of each. Now, I've talked about this before, and it's not really the place to discuss it here. But I've talked about this, that you cannot study a language outside of the culture. I've talked about how we saw it in Ireland, where they tried to rebirth the Irish or the Celtic culture and language, and by forcing it didn't go over. Same here in Canada with our native languages. Many of them were just lost, and they're being forced. They're a construct at best, an ersatz example of what once was, a poor copy of. So the idea here is you must live and be in the culture. And that's where I suffered, because even within Canada, I had to look outside of our country to get the adequate media for French, to stay, at least not to lose it. Like I said, I went to school with a number of French and English, mostly Anglophone, learning French. But of all the people I went to school with, the only people that kept their French, and that's barely even, were the people who spoke French outside of the class, right? I knew one girl who spoke French at home, another who should have went to a French school, but her parents, again, smartly knew that she should probably have a perfect English accent. That's something I spent years trying to work on. And you'll see, my French accent has suffered because of it. I tend to lean on the Quebec accent when I used to be very, continental in my accent. I used to get recognized as, like, say, from Monaco or something because of my accent. I'm not saying I look like I was some rich guy. I just mean I spoke English and French. It seemed in a native way, but in a very unique way. And it's because of having grown up in Northern Ontario. I wasn't speaking Quebec French per se, but I could. But I digress. So as I said, true fluency requires constant maintenance, and part of that is in culture. So I'll go on. Cut to personal footage, studying ancient Greek texts, translating Old English, or analyzing kanji. This is where my method differs. Instead of chasing conversational fluency in 10 languages, I expand understanding without interfering with actual expression. I can learn to read Sino-Japanese and classical Chinese without needing to speak them. I can analyze Uralic languages, structures, without seeking near-native fluency. This is the difference between a philologist and a surface-level polyglot. So, supporting linguistic theories of what I've been talking about here. So, critical period hypothesis. This is Landenberg, 1967. Language learning is most effective in childhood, while adults can acquire multiple languages. Maintaining fluency in several at once becomes increasingly difficult. Another example is interference theory. When multiple languages are actively spoken, cognitive interference occurs, reducing fluency and increasing lexical retrieval issues. So it's just harder to think of words. I've run into that myself. This relates to cognitive dissonance. This is what I've mentioned about some people have a difficult time understanding someone speaking English with a strong accent. And that's not just them being rude. It is cognitive dissonance. I talked about this in the news recently, right? Trump said he couldn't understand a reporter asking a question. And people are, some people think he's being mean, but my mother couldn't understand Paul Hogan, Crocodile Dundee. So it doesn't surprise me. When I worked at the bank, I regularly would have to take the phone for other people because we had so many call centers, like our Visa Center. They used to call it the Visa Center because the accents were so strong. And I guess, I don't know, it's either because of my dyslexia or my left-right brain, my language, whatever it may be. I always had a really, well, actually, I think I know what it might be. They argue that dyslexia might have something to do with recognizing phonemes, sounds. And I have this weird, it's a weird experience or a weird affect that I can hear the funniest things when people say things. But I hear them both. I hear like the funny things they say, like, the song, There's a Bad Moon on the Rise. And some people say it sounds like, there's a bathroom on the right. Well, I hear that in my everyday life, but I think it's related to code switching, but also pattern recognition and problem solving. My brain works out what they might be saying. And the reason why I think that's how that works is it's the same when it comes to multiple languages. Because I grew up in Northern Ontario. And so there was multiple languages being spoken, right? I grew up around, there was Italian being spoken and native Canadian being spoken, but certainly English and French all the time, everywhere I went. So you have this weird experience where you might hear someone speaking, but if you don't know what language it is, you might not recognize what they say. And until I really started to practice my real-time inline translation of English and French, I had a real hard time that code switching, because when I spoke English, I thought in English. I thought, I dreamt. And in French, I think in French and dreamt in French, right? So when we switch between, right, I mentioned this before that, the church up the road, I used to go for the thrift store, and, they asked me to help, run a French class. And I suggested a Bible study class, right? Because you know me, I love scripture, I love wisdom, literature of all kinds. And they were kind of offended by that. But what I found funny is the one lady who wants the French class, because she wants practice and yada yada. I found out that she actually teaches French to grade school kids in the Catholic school board. And the reason why I was shocked by that is I have a hard time speaking French with her. And you'll never guess why. Because her French is so English in its pronunciation. She pronounces it with such a strong English accent that I have a hard time thinking and speaking French with her. It throws me out of French, keeps me in English. And I think this is this cognitive dissonance that we've talked about. And again, it goes back to my idea that we have an infinite store of focus. We just need to develop it. We need to work on it, right? Third example of this idea, support for it, is threshold hypothesis. That's Cummings, 1979. True bilingual competence requires a critical level of usage and exposure, limiting the number of languages that can be maintained fluently. The example I gave this to the wife is, I grew up in Canada, very diverse, right? But nowhere have I seen a community that maintains fluency in more than 2 languages, right? Not uncommon. You'll see them speaking English and then another native, right? I said before that there are bilingual Canadians here in Canada, English and French, but they're actually outnumbered by people who speak English and another language. But I don't know of a lot of communities that speak multiple languages at once. English, French, and Italian, or Tagalog. And right? Because I know there's a pastor up the road, she's Korean, and she struggles to speak English, and she cannot pronounce French or any of the native languages, even though they're phonetically spelled out for her. And I mentioned it to them at the church that I think it's because she spends too much time speaking Korean at home, right? Because I saw that in school, right? When I was learning French, the kids that spoke English at home and had no practice, their French was just awful. And the same could be said with some of the kids that I knew that spoke a different language at home. Their English suffered. Sure, not to everyone, right? I have an ear for accents. I can tell usually where someone's from just by the way they pronounce their English, right? They call it phonemes, right? So if you're from India, you have that distinctive English accent. You can work, Indian English accent. You can work to try to hide it. I've talked about this when it comes to the French. The French, unless you have a trained ear, you'll think, Quebecois French. If you hear them speaking French, a little bit weird, but there's a big difference between Acadian French, Quebecois French, Northern Ontario French, right? Certainly Louisiana French, Haiti, the Ivory Coast. I have a good friend from the Côte d'Ivoire, and his French is beautiful. I think it's even more beautiful than Parisian, but yeah, it's about phonemes, right? He's from the west coast of Africa, right? Because if he was from, say, from Algeria, their French is very heavily influenced by their native tongue, and it sounds very different. You can pick them up almost right away. All right, but it takes a trained ear, right? And the ear is trained like we learn grammar for the most part, subconsciously, in situ, by being in a community and using our language and speaking and being fluent. I've talked about this before, the trick that I've always talked about, and this 100% connects to Cummings' studies, theories, is the idea that you need to spend, as much time as possible exclusively in the language. I see it all the time on Discord. These people, they think they speak English well, but they absolutely do not. I can say that about our Canadian politicians as well. Per Poliver up here in Canada, one of the better English-speaking politicians that is learning French. He's getting better by the day because I think he's practicing and challenging himself and engaging in conversations and arguments and discussions, debates in French. And that's how you get there, right? I talked about this before, that Justin Trudeau, his French isn't that much better than, say, what he always used, because, he got grade 10 French or what have you, and he never really progressed beyond that, right? He had a very limited vocabulary, and that just didn't grow because he wasn't challenging himself, right? So more examples I go on here. Working memory limits. This is Badley from 1986. The cognitive load of switching between multiple languages strains our working memory, making it difficult to sustain fluency in more than 2 languages at once. Now, I've talked about this before. I think the dyslexic shows us that the working memory can be fixed. It can be adjusted. There's maybe even 3 kinds of memory, not just the 2 that we used to talk about, right? Your short-term working memory and then the long-term. There may even be, like I said, an infinite store of focus, and this may apply to our memory. I think if we were to start believing ourselves able to have these memory hacks that some people do, I think it could be much more common that people could, develop their short-term and their working memory and then their long-term with simply, I'm hesitating to use the word mindfulness because it's got the negative connotation, but like this focus, this awareness, this presence that we need to bring to everything that we do, right? And as a fifth example, this is a diglossia, Ferguson, 1959. The division between high and low language use illustrates that even native speakers adjust fluency depending on context, reinforcing the idea that fluency requires constant active engagement. Another example I use is, I know a gentleman, a linguist, he talks about how, like, if he does a video, he'll definitely use the future tense of to eat, like mangiare. But if he were chatting with his dad, like, he wouldn't be pedantic like that. Same with, like, in French. Like, there's different levels of French. Like, because I was taught fairly advanced French when I was young, what I found is I used words that were just too advanced. Like when I was doing telemarketing in high school, I would call into Quebec and I would use these words, and I would have to use simpler words because they weren't familiar with them. They weren't, in fact, the most extreme example was, I guess I was speaking too fast, and I was working for this company, the air purifying thing. And part of the script that I wrote it myself, French, was I mentioned a vaporisateur. I was pretty proud of myself because, you know, I went and got all the fancy words. And the one person was so funny. He was like, "What?" So I said, "Vaporisateur." I don't say it as well or as fast as I probably would have back then. But he's like, "What?" I said, a vaporizer. And he's like, "Ah, oui, oui, okay." Another one is like, you don't say, réfrigérateur. You would say frigo, right? Otherwise you'd sound kind of weird, but it's neither here nor there. This idea that language, high and low, but there's also different kinds of code switching. In Japanese, for example, you don't speak to an elder or, like your boss with the same language as you would with a friend. Right? You use different words and different tone, right? So, this code switching goes beyond just, multi-language. It even goes within the language that we use. I think someone mentioned this before. He said, he works with his hands, and he says the guys he works with, they talk fine, they speak fine, no problems, smart guys, talking about whatever you want. But if, like, their manager, their boss shows up and they're trying to use big words and trying to sound all fancy and they just stumbling all over themselves. This is this, multi-level language, layering, right? But I digress. So in our final scene, we're back in the study. Books are open, a notebook filled with handwritten notes and various scripts. Languages are tools, not magic tricks. To truly understand them, we must respect the limits of fluency, recognize trade-offs, and embrace the challenge of lifelong learning. The real question isn't how many languages can you speak, but rather how deeply do you know the ones you claim to master. So there you go. So that's the script. It was just something I mentioned to the wife. We have a politician whose wife is an immigrant from, I think, the Philippines. So I'm assuming she speaks Tagalog, but don't quote me on that. She may even speak, I believe, some Spanish. But she came to Quebec, so they forced him to learn French and then English. She's excellent. Her French is excellent. Her English is excellent. And she seemed to have spoken Filipino or what have you, and it seemed to have been fine. Her Spanish doesn't seem quite, but that might be just how she learned it. But then someone like my wife, she doesn't realize that almost anyone can learn to speak a few sentences, like these polyglots, and sound like they're native. So I was trying to get across to her. She is the idea that she may or may not be trilingual. Right? We'll never know until we actually have her, like I said, sit down and actually try to have a debate. I was just proven right about that here in Canada. I just put up a little short on YouTube talking about how bizarre bilingualism is here in Canada. We just had a liberal leader debate. They had it in French just a couple nights ago, and then last night they had it in English. I've been saying this all along that none of them speak French properly. But they've been able to get away with it because they've been practicing. Like Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau, for years all of his French was practiced. And you could tell, because if he was asked to say something in French, he'd be like, and a big pause. And then it was like night and day between his prepared statements in French and his responses, right? I wouldn't be much different, I'll be honest, right? That's how language works. The only way for him to get proficient and be able to speak, like another example is a Quebec politician by the name of Blanchette. His French is beautiful and his English is fantastic as well, but he just does not like to lower himself to speaking English. But I digress. As I said, language, bilingualism, meaning, understanding, context, all of that, honesty, right? That's the big thing. Like, I was watching Ian McGilchrist, and he clearly mentioned this idea that Dunning-Kruger taught us that the less that you know, the more you think you know. But the other lesson from Dunning-Kruger is the more you know, the more you tend to think no one else knows as much as you do. Right? I've talked about this, that because I've been so heavily self-taught, I've experienced both in class and digital classes, as well as self-directed stuff where you get the books yourself, or you even just follow the course along, self-directed course. And so what I've come to realize is it's about how deeply we're engaging. It's about devotion. It's about commitment. It's what I've talked about, that if only 9% of our doctors are staying up to date on the data, well then they're 40 years behind on what they know on their profession. So they're out of date. Imagine if your plumber showed up to your house and he saw your toilet that you had installed just 5 years ago when the house was built, and he says, "Oh, sorry, I can't work on that. I've only been trained to work on 40-year-old toilets." Or the same guy shows up and isn't honest with you and starts messing with your brand new toilet and putting in 40-year-old parts, and it never works right. Right? This is an actual thing, right? The new parts for toilets do not fit old toilets. It's kind of funny how this is actually a thing. That's medical. That's our science today, right? By the time you're taught this in school as a student, an early, student of science or of becoming a doctor, your teachers are teaching you stuff that's 20 years old. What they know is maybe even 40 years old. So if you don't graduate and question what you were taught and question what you've come to understand, Wissenschaft, German for science, then you're going to fail. And what's sad is, in a doctor's case or a scientist's case, they're not just failing themselves, they're failing humanity. They're failing all of us. And so this is where I think this idea of jack of all trades, master of none, sometimes better than one, because, well, philology is dead in a sense. We think of just linguistics. And it's a great metaphor for how we've dumbed down, flattened, or simplified our world. Because philology isn't just about linguistics. Philology is about understanding. What is language? Why do we use it? How do we use it? How does it shape us? How do we shape it? How does it shape our world? How does our world shape us? How does our world shape our language? And all of what that may mean and apply to other fields of philosophy, of science, of mathematics, of social, of you name it. Because philology used to be considered a science. Linguistics, I don't know. But I digress. It's for this that I provide this podcast. I started as just a way to understand what I was trying to figure out. And now it's gotten to the point where I'm trying to understand why so few others seem to understand this. Even those with a PhD, sometimes worse, multiple master's degrees, they seem to not see the forest for the trees. This over-specialization, as I said, this is why I'm mentioning this I would call it a modern philology, I wouldn't be as multidisciplinary. I wouldn't understand Jung and Nietzsche and philology. I wouldn't understand to be able to translate multiple languages. I wouldn't know about Buddhism and the Greeks and, well, scripture of all kinds. I'd maybe know how to speak maybe a third language. That's where I'd at. In the last 30 years studying Sanskrit, if I had bothered trying to read the script of Sanskrit, well, I wouldn't be where I'm at. I wouldn't have studied the Gita, front to back, more times than I can count. The Upanishads, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. I'd probably still be working on the 3rd chapter of the Gita, just reading and learning how to read the Sanskrit and how to write it. As an example, I was in a class, my Gita class, and I made a stupid error. I said upakara with a K instead of upakara with a C, right? But I think if I had spent the last 30 years learning the difference between upakara with a K and upakara with a C, I would have missed the importance of what upakara with the C and the K is telling us. Right? Forest for the trees. And honestly, my prof asked, how do we modernize things like Shaivism? How do we bring this to a modern audience? And I say that's how. By recontextualizing these ideas, right? I used to make fun of Jordan Peterson, talk about Pinocchio and the Lion King, but come to realize that the only way to help people realize the value of these ideas, for them to see the meaning in these things, is to get them engaged, to get them to value it, make them a creator. The way I explain it is E.E. Cummings. He's a famous poet, I guess I would say. He's famous, I think, mostly for me because he strips out the grammar and the punctuation of his poems, thereby forcing you to be the author, right? Agency. And that's what we need. We need more people, karma yoga, acting in the world, action, right? But I digress. I'm just trying to avoid reading it in French because I told you my French has gotten horrible. So without further ado, here is the podcast in translation. So, le titre, L'illusion de la maîtrise polyglotte, la perspective d'un philologue. Un bureau faiblement éclairé, rempli de livres dans plusieurs langues. La caméra balaye de textes ouverts en grec, latin, japonais et russe. Une voix parle en arrière-plan. La langue est une chose vivante. Elle évolue, elle respire et elle s'enracine dans l'esprit, différemment pour chaque locuteur. Ou, fil des années, j'ai étudié plusieurs langues, non seulement appris à les parler, mais aussi à les comprendre profondément. Je travaille avec les langues en tant que philologue, appliquant des compétences structurelles et comparatives pour déchiffrer le sens à travers les cultures et l'histoire. Et à travers cela, j'ai découvert quelque chose de controversé. La plupart des gens, même les soi-disant polyglottes, ne pouvant pas réellement maintenir la fluidité dans plus de 2 langues à la fois. Plan sur un tableau blanc avec 3 sections, fluent, fonctionnel et reconnaissable. Chacune affichait différentes langues écrites en dessus. L'acquisition des langues suit une hiérarchie. À tout moment, nous pouvons maintenir une langue à un niveau profond et intuitif.
la langue dans laquelle nous pensons, rêvons et exprimons nos émotions. Une deuxième langue de manière fluide, mais légèrement moins naturelle, peut être apprise plus tard ou maintenue par un usage quotidien. Une troisième ou une quatrième langue de manière plus mécanique, fonctionnelle, mais pas vraiment fluide. Au-delà, la compréhension remplace la fluidité active. On peut lire, comprendre et même traduire, mais la production spontanée en souffre. Comme faire des images de célèbres polyglottes YouTube passant d'une langue à l'autre, la caméra zoome sur des pauses maladroites, une grammaire forcée et des incohérences. Les polyglottes en ligne vendent une illusion. Ils passent d'une langue à l'autre, impressionnant leur public, mais la fluidité ne se limitait pas à rappeler des mots. Il s'agit de grammaire instinctive, de nuances culturelles et de résonance émotionnelle. Ces compétences prenant des années à se développer, même dans une seule langue. Une véritable fluidité nécessite un entretien constant. Et l'ajout de nouvelles langues réduit inévitablement la profondeur de chacune. Coupe vers des séquences personnelles, études de textes grecs anciens, traduction d'anglais ancien ou analyse de kanji. C'est là que ma méthode diffère. Plutôt que de poursuivre la fluidité conversationnelle dans 10 langues, j'élargis la compréhension sans interférer avec l'expression active. Je peux apprendre à lire le sino-japonaise et le chinois classique sans avoir besoin de les parler. Je peux analyser la structure des langues réellement sans chercher une fluidité proche du natif. C'est la différence entre une philologue et une polyglotte de surface. Les langues sont des outils, pas des tours de magie. Pour les comprendre véritablement, nous devons respecter les limites de la fluidité, reconnaître les compris et l'embrasser le défi de l'apprentissage à vie. La vraie question n'est pas combien de langues pouvez-vous parler, mais plutôt à quel point connaissez-vous profondément celle que vous prétendez maîtriser. Oh, I'm sorry. Just didn't work out. I read through it earlier and I was fine. My French was fine. I pronounced it just fine, but today it was terrible. But see, there you go. See, fluency and fluidity, shifts. And, that's even if you speak one language, right? But imagine if you speak multiple. On that, have a wonderful day. Thanks for listening.